Background: the Syrian Civil War, 2011 to present time. We're going to go over the start, how the war began in 2011, and the similarities between what happened then and what is currently happening in the United States. The war began in 2011 after peaceful protests during the Arab Spring were met with brutal force by President Bashar al-Assad's government. The crackdown escalated into an armed conflict between Assad's regime and various opposition groups. Internal conflict turns regional, 2011 through 2013. Protests and crackdown, 2011. Syrians protested for democracy and reform. Assad's forces responded with arrests, torture, and live fire. Formation of rebel groups. Defectors from the Syrian army and civilians formed the Free Syrian Army, or FSA, and other rebel groups. Chaos and fragmentation. Over time, the opposition splintered into secular rebels, Islamist fractions, and local militias. Foreign involvement begins years 2012 through 2014. We have Iran and Hezbollah. The Lebanese militia allied with Iran intervened early to support Assad, sending fighters, weapons, and advisors. Then we have the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. They began funding and arming certain rebel groups to counter Iran's influence. Turkey allowed rebel fighters and refugees across its border and later launched operations against Kurdish forces it saw as a threat. The United States and European countries provided limited support to moderate rebels through covert CIA programs. Rise of ISIS and the U.S.-led intervention of 2014 through 2015. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, grew out of the chaos. But in reality, ISIS was funded by the West, and 90% of its victims were Muslims. From Votorum via Torres, October 23, 2025, seizing large territories in both Syria and Iraq. In 2014, the U.S. formed a coalition, including the UK, France, and others, to conduct airstrikes in Syria without Assad's permission, targeting ISIS strongholds. The U.S. also partnered with Kurdish forces, YPG and SDF, in northern Syria to fight ISIS on the ground. Russia's major intervention, 2015. So Russia officially entered the war in September 2015, launching airstrikes and deploying troops at Assad's invitation. Although Russia claimed to fight ISIS, much of its bombing targeted anti-Assad rebels, helping the regime regain territory. This turned the tide of the war in Assad's favor. Turkish and Israeli operations from 2016 to present. Turkey invaded northern Syria multiple times. Operations Euphrates Shield, Olive Branch, and Peace Spring, mainly to fight Kurdish groups near its border and to control refugee flows. Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria since 2013, targeting Iranian and Hezbollah forces to prevent them from entrenching near its border. The aftermath. By the late 2010s, Assad's government, backed by Russia and Iran, had retaken most major cities. The U.S. and Kurdish allies controlled parts of the northeast. Turkey controlled border regions in the north. ISIS lost most of its territory but continued as an insurgency. Essentially, Syria became a battlefield for global and regional powers, each pursuing their own agendas, making it one of the most complex wars of the 21st century. Civil war like Syria's didn't happen overnight. It followed a breakdown of trust between citizens and their government, regional polarization, and foreign interference. Looking at patterns can help us understand how societies can weaken internally and what helps prevent that. Here are some key factors from Syria that serve as warnings for any country, including the U.S. Deep political polarization. In Syria, long-standing grievances against Assad's authoritarian rule exploded when protests were violently suppressed. risk anywhere. When political groups stop seeing each other as legitimate opponents and start seeing each other as enemies, it creates conditions for conflict. Prevention: maintaining space for peaceful disagreement, free press, and accountable institutions helps societies stay resilient. Erosions of trust in institutions. In Syria, many people no longer believed courts, police, or elections could protect them, so they turned to armed groups. In the US, when trust in elections, justice systems, or media declines, citizens become more vulnerable to radicalization. Economic inequality and desperation. In Syria, droughts, joblessness, and wealth inequality worsened public anger before 2011. In the US, high inequality, housing crisis, or unstable work can make people feel hopeless, conditions that extremist movements, such as the government movement of COINTELPRO, can exploit. Collapse of shared identity. In Syria, sectarian divisions, Sunni, Alawite, Kurdish, Christian, etc., were manipulated by political elites to keep power, and still are to this day in Syria, in the US, throughout the world. In the US, if political, racial, or religious identities become weaponized, us versus them, it erodes the idea of a shared nation. Violence becoming normalized. When protests or political disputes are met with increasing violence or threats, it signals democratic breakdown. The more normalized violence becomes in rhetoric or action, the harder it is to pull back. What prevents this? Strong local communities and civic engagement. Neighbors still caring for each other beyond politics. Dialogue and education that builds media literacy and empathy. Reforms that rebuild trust, fair systems, accountability, and safety nets. Nonviolence and community leadership that holds space for peace when emotions run high.